First contact gone wrong. The Viridian Collective's flagship emerged from hyperspace at the edge of Sol's asteroid belt, its crystalline hull refracting sunlight in dazzling patterns. Admiral Talara, her iridescent scales shifting with concern, studied the primitive vessels scattered throughout the system. The humans called them research stations and mining platforms, but her centuries of experience told her otherwise. Another probe approaching, Admiral, her sensor officer reported. Primitive nuclear propulsion, minimal shielding. They call it Voyager 3. Talara's inner eyelids narrowed. The humans were clever, she had to admit. While other species announced their military might with grand fleets and energy weapons, these newcomers masked their true intentions behind a facade of scientific curiosity. Every probe, every satellite, every mining operation could be a weapons platform in disguise. Track all human vessels, she commanded. I want detailed scans of their capabilities. The response came instantly. Admiral, they're using radio waves for communication. Unencrypted. Impossible. No spacefaring race would be so exposed. Talara's scales rippled with disbelief. Yet the evidence was clear. The humans broadcast their messages openly, sharing scientific data, personal communications, and even entertainment across the void. Either they were inconceivably naive, or this was the most elaborate deception she'd encountered in 3 centuries of service. The truth, as the collective would soon learn, was neither. At Mission Control in Houston, Dr. Sarah Chen stared at her monitor in disbelief. Director, you need to see this. The anomaly we detected. It's not natural. It's a ship. A big one. Director James Harrison leaned over her shoulder, coffee forgotten in his hand. First contact, he breathed. My God, we're actually having first contact. Sir, Sarah's voice tightened. They're scanning everything. Our stations, our satellites, even the deep space probes. These readings, their technology is centuries beyond ours. Before Harrison could respond, every screen in Mission Control lit up with the same message, transmitted in perfect English. Attention Human Military Command. Your attempts at subterfuge have been noted. Cease all hostile reconnaissance activities immediately. Harrison blinked. Military Command. What military command? Sir, Sarah's fingers flew across her keyboard. They're targeting our research stations. They think we're hiding weapons. That's ridiculous. Harrison grabbed the microphone. This is Director James Harrison of NASA. We are a civilian space agency. Our missions are peaceful. The collective's response came as a beam of energy that vaporized the International Space Station. In the chaos that followed, as governments scrambled and militaries mobilized, few noticed Dr. Chen's quiet observation. They just made a terrible mistake. They judged us by their standards, assumed we think like them. But that's not how humans work. She was right. The Viridian Collective expected submission in the face of overwhelming technological superiority. Instead, humanity's response could be summed up in the words of General Maria Santos, speaking to the hastily assembled Earth Defense Council. They took out a research station full of scientists and astronauts from 15 different nations. They think this show of force will make us back down. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Someone get me a beer. We're about to show these aliens why you don't pick a fight with a species that turned nuclear fusion into clean energy and still keeps boxing as a sport. In orbit, Admiral Talara watched with growing unease as human vessels scattered across the system, not in retreat, but in what appeared to be carefully coordinated chaos. Their movements defied traditional military doctrine, their responses unpredictable. Admiral, her tactical officer's voice wavered. The humans, they're launching thousands of small objects from their planet. Weapons? Unknown. Our sensors can't. They're made of primitive materials. Metal, plastics, simple electronics. Talara's unease deepened. In all her years of service, she'd never encountered a species that responded to superior force with such apparent randomness. The humans weren't following any known doctrine of war. They weren't even following their own primitive military protocols. They were improvising. And as the first wave of what humans would later call Operation Beer Run approached her fleet, a swarm of modified communications satellites, retrofitted mining drones, and hastily weaponized space debris, Admiral Tilera began to understand that she had made a catastrophic error in judgment. The humans weren't hiding their military capability behind civilian projects. They were turning their civilian projects into military capabilities. And they were just getting started. The hidden advantage. The Viridian Collective's War Council had never seen Admiral Tilera show emotion. Yet here she was, her scales flickering between shades of distress as she delivered her report. They weaponized their garbage, she said flatly. Their orbital debris, their defunct satellites, they turned them into kinetic weapons. We lost 3 cruisers to what appeared to be an old human weather satellite. High Commander Zixtal's tendrils writhed with disbelief. Impossible. Their technology is primitive. They don't even have gravity manipulation. That's exactly the problem. Tilera continued. We based our strategic analysis on technological advancement. We assumed their civilian infrastructure was a facade for military installations. Instead, they're turning everything into a weapon. They're not fighting the way an advanced civilization should. On Earth, the situation was equally unprecedented, but for entirely different reasons. In an abandoned mining facility deep beneath the Australian outback, Dr. Chen watched in amazement as miners and engineers transformed industrial equipment into military assets. It's beautiful, isn't it? General Santos stood beside her, watching a massive mining laser being modified. They thought we'd be helpless without advanced technology. They don't understand that humans have been turning random objects into weapons since we figured out rocks could hurt. The mining laser, originally designed to cut through ore deposits, was being retrofitted with targeting systems salvaged from video game consoles. Next to it, a team of engineers had transformed an industrial electromagnet into what they cheerfully called a space debris accelerator. But will it be enough? Chen asked, watching the controlled chaos around them. Their ships have shields that can deflect asteroids. Santos grinned. That's why we're not trying to break through their shields. We're going to make them use their shields until their power runs dry. Every piece of space junk we throw at them, every mining drone we send their way, it all forces them to maintain their defensive systems. The general's tablet pinged with an update. Speaking of which, Operation Scrapyard is already showing results. The collected ships are maintaining constant shield coverage. Their energy consumption must be astronomical. In orbit, Admiral Tilera was reaching the same conclusion. Her fleet's energy reserves were depleting faster than expected. The humans weren't trying to destroy her ships. They were forcing them to constantly defend against thousands of small, seemingly random threats. Admiral, her engineering officer reported, we're detecting unusual radiation signatures from Earth, multiple locations. Tilera's scales paled. Nuclear weapons? No. Something else. The signatures don't match any known weapon system. They're inconsistent, chaotic. On Earth, in laboratories and workshops across the globe, humanity was doing what it did best, improvising. Nuclear physicists worked alongside garage inventors. Video game developers collaborated with military strategists. Every wild idea, every what-if scenario that had ever been dismissed as impractical was now on the table. In a secret facility beneath MIT, a team of quantum physicists had repurposed their experimental quantum entanglement array into what they called a shield fuzzer, a device that created microscopic irregularities in energy fields. Each irregularity was tiny, barely noticeable. But there were thousands of them, each requiring additional power to compensate. Meanwhile, in a seemingly abandoned warehouse in Osaka, a group of robotics engineers who normally designed entertainment androids were creating something unprecedented. They called it the Space Barnacle, a swarm of tiny robots that attached themselves to ship hulls and did nothing but generate heat, forcing enemy vessels to expend even more energy on thermal regulation. The collective's response to these tactics was telling. They attempted to adapt their strategies to respond with overwhelming force. But every time they thought they had countered a human tactic, 3 more appeared. They're not following any logical progression, Tilera reported to the War Council. Their attacks aren't building toward a strategic objective we can identify. It's as if they're making it up as they go along. High Commander Zixtal's tendrils twisted in frustration. That's impossible. No species can wage war without a grand strategy. The humans can, Tilera replied. And that's not the worst part. Every time we destroy one of their weapons, they don't try to rebuild it. They build something completely different instead. We're not fighting a war against their technology. We're fighting a war against their creativity. Back on Earth, in the Australian Command Center, Dr. Chen watched as another wave of retrofitted mining drones launched toward the collective fleet. These ones had been modified by a team of Australian engineers who normally designed racing drones. They moved in patterns that defied prediction, their trajectories based on chaos theory algorithms originally developed for weather forecasting. You know what the best part is? General Santos said, watching the launches. Even if they figure out how to counter everything we're throwing at them, it doesn't matter. Because none of it, is our actual military response. Chen looked at her sharply. What do you mean? Santos smiled. Everything they're seeing. The modified satellites, the mining drones, the quantum fuzzers. It's all civilian tech, modified by civilian engineers. Our actual military capabilities haven't even come into play yet. We're letting them waste energy and resources countering our improvised solutions while we prepare our real response. In orbit, Admiral Tilera received another report of declining energy reserves. As she watched her tactical display fill with thousands of approaching objects, each one emanating a different type of energy signature, each one requiring a different type of defensive response, she began to understand the true nature of her mistake. The collective had assumed humanity's civilian infrastructure was hiding military capabilities. Instead, humanity's civilian infrastructure was becoming military capabilities, and somewhere, hidden beneath all this chaos and improvisation, their actual military forces were preparing something else entirely. Tilera's scales shifted to the deep blue of revelation. She had not started a war against a primitive species playing at being advanced. She had started a war against a species that turned primitiveness itself into an advantage. And they were just getting warmed up. Operation Thunderstrike. Ever played video games, Admiral? General Santos addressed the Joint Military Command, her holographic form flickering slightly in the underground bunker's dim light. Because what we're about to do is basically the oldest trick in the gaming book, we're going to use the tutorial as a distraction. The assembled military leaders from around the world watched as she pulled up a holographic display of the ongoing space battle. The collected ships were surrounded by a cloud of human improvised weapons and devices, their energy shields constantly flickering as they dealt with thousands of small threats. For the past 2 weeks, we've let them think they're learning how humans fight. They've adapted to our primitive tactics, developed countermeasures for our improvised weapons. But they've never actually faced Earth's combined military might. Until now. Deep beneath the Pacific Ocean, the first phase of Operation Thunderstrike was already in motion. Submarines from a dozen nations had quietly positioned themselves along the seafloor, their modified nuclear reactors humming with purpose. They weren't carrying missiles. They were carrying something far more devastating. In orbit, Admiral Tilera was finally feeling confident. Her fleet had adapted to human tactics, their shields now optimized to handle the constant barrage of makeshift weapons. Energy consumption was still high, but manageable. Admiral, her sensor officer called out, we're detecting unusual energy signatures from the planet's oceans. Before Tilera could respond, every submarine reactor on Earth activated simultaneously. The resulting electromagnetic pulse was unlike anything the collective had ever encountered, not because it was particularly advanced, but because it was deliberately crude. The massive wave of electromagnetic energy wasn't designed to penetrate shields or disable systems. It was designed to be inefficient, to create noise that forced the collective's sensitive sensors to work overtime processing it. Second phase, Santos ordered. Across the globe, power plants that had been quietly modified over the past 2 weeks suddenly changed their output patterns. Nuclear plants, solar arrays, wind farms, every power generation facility on Earth began producing energy in erratic, seemingly random patterns. The collective's sensor systems, already struggling with the submarine-generated EMPs, were overwhelmed trying to analyze and categorize the endless streams of contradictory energy readings. "They're blinding themselves," Dr. Chen observed from her position in the command center. "Their sensors are too good, too sensitive. They can't just ignore readings like we would. They have to process everything." "Exactly," Santos nodded. "And while their systems are busy processing all that noise high in the thermosphere, humanity's actual military response was about to reveal itself. What the collective had assumed were normal weather satellites were actually platforms for a weapons system that had been in development since the Cold War, Project Thor. Tungsten rods, Santos explained to the command staff, 20 feet long, specially treated to survive atmospheric re-entry. No explosives, no advanced technology. Just good old-fashioned kinetic energy. And we've had 2 weeks to position them, while the collective was distracted by our primitive attacks." Tilara realized too late what was happening. Her ship's sensors, overwhelmed by the endless streams of electromagnetic noise from Earth, barely registered the small objects detaching from the satellites above. By the time they were identified as threats, the tungsten rods were already accelerating toward her fleet at orbital velocities. The first rod struck a collective cruiser amidships. There was no explosion, no energy discharge, just the simple, devastating transfer of kinetic energy. The ship's shields, optimized to handle the small impacts they'd been dealing with for weeks, might as well have been tissue paper. "All ships, reconfigure shields." Tilara ordered, but it was too late. More rods were falling, and her fleet's energy reserves were already depleted from weeks of constant shield operation against the swarm of improvised weapons. But Operation Thunderstrike wasn't finished. As the collective fleet scrambled to deal with the kinetic bombardment, the true purpose of all those modified civilian devices became clear. They weren't weapons. They were targeting beacons. Every piece of space debris, every retrofitted satellite, every space barnacle that had attached itself to a collective ship was now broadcasting targeting data to Earth's military satellites. The civilian hardware had created a perfect targeting grid for the actual military response. Final phase, Santos commanded. Across Earth's surface, hidden silos opened. But they didn't launch nuclear missiles. Those were too obvious, too expected. Instead, they launched what the development team had nicknamed Q-balls, relatively small projectiles designed to use the collective ships themselves as weapons. The Q-balls, guided by the targeting grid of civilian devices, struck the already damaged collective ships at precisely calculated angles. Physics did the rest, sending the massive alien vessels careening into each other in a cascade of collision-induced destruction. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Santos mused, watching the tactical display. They thought our civilian technology was hiding military capabilities. Instead, our military capabilities were hiding behind civilian technology. In orbit, Admiral Tilara watched her fleet dissolve into chaos. The humans hadn't just outfought them. They had turned the very assumptions of advanced warfare against them. Every primitive solution had been a setup, every improvised weapon a piece of a larger puzzle. "Admiral," her surviving tactical officer reported, "we're detecting new launches from the surface. Different signatures this time. More coherent." Tilara's scales shifted to the gray of resignation. "Those," she said quietly, "will be their actual weapons." She opened a channel to the collective's high command. "Request immediate withdrawal authorization. We severely miscalculated. The humans weren't showing us their capabilities in those first 2 weeks. They were teaching themselves how to defeat ours. The lesson was expensive. By the time the surviving collective ships managed to retreat, they had learned a fundamental truth about humanity. The most dangerous weapon in their arsenal wasn't their technology, their military, or even their improvisation. It was their ability to make their enemies think they knew what was coming next. The psychology of war. The Collective's War College had never held an emergency session in its 1,000-year history, yet here they were, the greatest military minds of a dozen advanced species, trying to understand how they had been so thoroughly outmaneuvered by a primitive race. High Commander Zixtal watched the holographic replay of the battle for the 100th time. They used our own sophistication against us, he mused. Every prediction model, every tactical analysis, failed because they were based on rational progression of warfare. In the back of the chamber, Admiral Tilara stood silently, her scales still bearing the gray tinge of recent combat. They don't think like us, she finally said. They don't see limitations. They see possibilities. When we destroyed their space station, we thought we were demonstrating our superiority. Instead, we were giving them permission to improvise. On Earth, the mood was markedly different. In what had once been a football stadium in Rio de Janeiro, now converted into a strategy center, Dr. Chen watched as teams of analysts pored over data from the battle. But they weren't military analysts. They were game designers, social media experts, and behavioral psychologists. The Collective's next move will be to analyze and adapt, General Santos explained, walking through the rows of workstations. They'll try to understand our strategy, to predict our next innovation. That's exactly what we want them to do. Because they'll be looking for patterns that don't exist, Chen realized. Exactly. While they're trying to decode our strategy, we're already moving on to completely different approaches. We're not playing chess. We're playing Calvin ball. The reference drew blank looks from the international staff, but the point was clear. Humanity wasn't following any established rules of warfare because they weren't treating this as a traditional war. They were treating it as a problem to be solved, and humans had a peculiar way of solving problems. In deep space, the Collective was learning this lesson the hard way. Their scout ships, sent to monitor Earth's defensive preparations, reported bewildering findings. Some human facilities were clearly building advanced weapons, while others appeared to be hosting what looked like gaming tournaments. Military bases were conducting serious combat drills alongside what appeared to be improvised comedy shows. They're psychologically erratic, one scout reported. In one human facility, they've converted their cafeteria into both a weapons testing range and what they call the meme creation center. We can't determine which activity they consider more militarily significant. The answer, of course, was both. While the Collective's analysts tried to separate military activities from civilian ones, humanity had erased the distinction entirely. Every activity, from weapons development to entertainment, was part of their war effort. In what used to be Silicon Valley, tech companies had transformed their gaming servers into military simulation systems. Social media algorithms were repurposed to predict alien behavioral patterns. Entertainment companies were producing what they called psychological warfare content, broadcasts specifically designed to confuse and disturb alien monitoring systems. Look at this, Chen said, pulling up a report. The Collective's intelligence division spent 3 days analyzing a TikTok video of someone cooking pasta with energy drinks, thinking it was some kind of coded military communication. Was it? Santos asked, amused. No, that's just Thursday on the internet. But while they were analyzing social media posts, they completely missed the fact that we've been using dating app algorithms to predict their fleet movements. The Collective's frustration was reaching a breaking point. Their entire approach to warfare was based on logical progression, on understanding and countering enemy capabilities. But how could they counter an enemy that treated military strategy like a brainstorming session at a startup company? In orbit around Mars, a Collective research vessel intercepted what they thought was a military transmission. After 3 days of analysis, they realized it was a human entertainment broadcast, something called reality television. But by the time they figured this out, the actual military operation had already used their distraction to slip past their sensors. "They're not just fighting us," Lara explained to the War College. "They're making us fight ourselves. Every time we adapt to one of their strategies, we're actually falling for a distraction. Our own perfectionism, our need to understand and categorize everything, has become a weakness." The final straw came when the collective intercepted what appeared to be a high-level military communication. After dedicating significant resources to decoding it, they discovered it was actually a heated debate about whether hot dogs could be classified as sandwiches. But here's the real problem. Lara continued, her scales shifting to the deep blue of revelation. "We can't ignore these communications because buried within them, hidden beneath layers of what appears to be nonsense, are their actual military strategies. They're using their own chaos as camouflage." In the Rio Command Center, General Santos received word that the collective's main fleet was falling back to their core systems. "They're starting to understand," she said, watching the tactical display. "Not our strategies. They're starting to understand that trying to understand us is their biggest mistake." Dr. Chen nodded. "We're not just winning the war," she said. "We're making them question everything they thought they knew about warfare itself." And that, as the collective was learning, was perhaps humanity's most devastating weapon of all. Their ability to turn confusion itself into a military asset. Respect through chaos. The Viridian Collective's Grand Council chamber had never hosted a peace delegation quite like this one. The human representatives sat casually at the ancient crystal table, one of them actually drinking something called coffee from an insulated container marked World's OKest Diplomat. High Commander Zixtal's tendrils twitched with barely contained confusion. "You understand," he said carefully, "that by all traditional metrics, your species should have been defeated. Your technology was inferior, your military forces smaller, your industrial capacity fraction of ours." Dr. Chen smiled, taking another sip of her coffee. "That was your first mistake, looking at traditional metrics. Humanity stopped measuring success by traditional metrics the moment we invented pizza with pineapple on it." General Santos, sitting beside her, suppressed a grin. The past month had taught the collective more about humanity than any first contact protocol ever could. They had learned that humans didn't just think outside the box. They questioned why the box existed in the first place, then turned it into something entirely different. "We analyzed your response to our initial aggression," Admiral Lara said, her scales now showing the deep green of respect. "Our tacticians still cannot agree on whether your strategy was brilliant or insane." "Yes," Santos replied simply. The collective leaders exchanged glances. They had come expecting a negotiation. Instead, they were getting another lesson in human unpredictability. "Your species turned social media algorithms into battlefield prediction systems," Lara continued. "You used dating apps to analyze our fleet movements. Your civilians developed weapons for mining equipment while watching entertainment shows. None of it follows any logical pattern of warfare." "That's because we weren't following a pattern," Chen explained. "We were creating new ones. Humans don't just adapt to situations, we transform them. When you destroyed our space station, you thought you were showing us our weakness. Instead, you showed us exactly how to defeat you." "By using primitive technology?" Zixtal asked. "By using everything," Santos corrected. "You saw our civilian infrastructure as a facade hiding military capabilities. But for humans, everything is potential military capability. A teenager's drone hobby, a programmer's dating algorithm, a physicist's crazy theory. They're all tools, waiting to be used in ways nobody has thought of before." The council chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. The collective had started this war believing they were dealing with a primitive species playing at being advanced. Instead, they had encountered a species that turned primitiveness itself into an advantage. "Your final attack," Lara said, The one that forced our retreat. Our analysts still can't determine if it was a carefully planned strategy or completely improvised. Chen and Santos exchanged amused glances. Would you believe it was both? Chen asked. We had plans, but we also had thousands of people coming up with new ideas in real time. Some of our most effective tactics came from soldiers making jokes in break rooms. That's what you don't understand about humans, Santos added. We don't separate our military thinking from our civilian thinking. Every human activity, from scientific research to social media posts, is potential innovation. We turned your war into a global brainstorming session. Zixtel's tendrils writhed with a mixture of frustration and admiration. You're saying that we lost not because you were stronger, but because you refused to fight the way we expected you to fight. We refused to fight the way anyone expected us to fight, Santos corrected, including ourselves. That's the real secret of human warfare. We surprise ourselves as much as we surprise our enemies. The peace treaty that emerged from that meeting was unlike any the collective had ever signed. Instead of traditional military limitations, it focused on cultural exchange. The collective had learned that understanding human culture was more crucial than understanding human military capability, because for humans, they were one and the same. As the human delegation prepared to leave, Admiral Tilera approached Dr. Chen with one final question. The phrase your species used when this all started, "Hold my beer." Our linguists still cannot determine its strategic significance. Chen laughed. It's not a strategy. It's a warning. When humans say, "Hold my beer," it means we're about to do something either brilliant or stupid, and we're not entirely sure which until we try it. And which was this war? Both. That's what makes us human. We don't just think outside the box. We forget the box exists, build a rocket out of it, and use it to deliver memes to your high command. As the human ships departed, the collective leaders watched in thoughtful silence. They had started this conflict believing they were dealing with a primitive species that needed to be taught its place in the galaxy. Instead, they had learned a crucial lesson. True advancement isn't measured by technological superiority, but by the ability to turn any situation to your advantage. And humans, as the galaxy was learning, could turn anything to their advantage, especially when someone told them it was impossible.